August 1945, Buckner Bay, Okinawa. Heat shimmered over the anchorage where U.S. Navy transports rode at their moorings, and the air smelled of diesel, wet hemp, and coral dust. Japanese prisoners, sunburned, insect-bitten, uniforms bleached to the color of sand, were marched up the gangways in silence that rasped like dry paper. The shock came early, not in a shout or a blow, but in the first glance at the galley line. White bread stacked in metal trays, coffee breathing steam from tall urns, meatloaf glazed and waiting under the sheen of galley lights. Years of broadcasts had taught them to expect filth and cruelty. They answered with tight smiles and a disdain rehearsed on empty stomachs. The ship slipped south for Guam and east for Hawaii, screws thrumming through a green Pacific, and the smell of baking drifted through the passageways. By afternoon, hunger peeled away ceremony. A cautious crust became a swallowed heel. The heel became a slice, then two. An officer later wrote that he had never known bread could smell like victory, and in the mess that word tasted like yeast and warmth. Morning brought eggs glossed with butter and fruit packed in heavy syrup. Noon, milk cold enough to sting teeth. Evening, a metal cup of ice cream, impossible and undeniable on a moving ship. No one spoke. The arithmetic was plain. The empire that preached spirit had starved. The enemy that mocked subtlety had mastered supply. As the transports neared the waypoints, harbors where the war's machinery ate and slept, the prisoners learned that the lesson would not end at sea. Ashore, the mess halls would teach it again, in portions even larger. 37, Shanghai. The smoke of victory parades hung above the riverfront, as imperial soldiers spooned white rice from dented tins and called it the taste of conquest. To the Japanese army, simplicity was sanctity. Gohan, steamed rice, sometimes cut with barley when the grain ran thin, was not just food, but faith. Every soldier learned that hunger forged endurance, and that comfort was the enemy of courage. Their morning miso soup was clear enough to see the bottom of the bowl, its flavor carried by a few pickled radishes or a sliver of sardine. Protein was privilege measured by rank, and meat a rare glimpse of luxury. Officers praised restraint as patriotism. To eat little was to honor the emperor. To crave more was to betray the spirit of Yamato. By 1943, that creed had turned from discipline to desperation. The Allied submarine blockade had strangled Japan's shipping lanes, cutting off rice from Korea, soy from Manchuria, and sugar from Taiwan. In the cities, civilians mixed millet, pine bark, and even shredded paper into their rations. Mothers boiled weeds for broth. Children lined up for hours to receive a single handful of barley. In the jungles of New Guinea, soldiers gnawed roots and stripped palm shoots, their bellies bloated with starch and sickness. Yet they believed starvation was proof of loyalty. A meal half-eaten was an offering to the war gods. Meanwhile, American abundance became a moral insult. Newspapers in Tokyo caricatured the fat American army, soldiers too soft to fight without canned meat and chocolate. Training manuals warned that Allied food was a weapon, designed to seduce the weak-willed. But indoctrination could not prepare men for their first bite of it. On Guadalcanal, captured troops stared in disbelief at tins of corned beef, peaches and syrup, and biscuits dense with sugar and fat. A prisoner from Attu later wrote that he tasted defeat before he understood it, his senses betraying the empire's illusions. What they had been taught to despise became a revelation, proof that America fought not only with steel, but with sustenance. That collision between scarcity and surplus, faith and flavor, would soon unfold in the prison camps where hunger met its conqueror. January 1942, snow drifted against the red brick laboratories of the University of Minnesota, as physiologist Ansel Keys scribbled the final notes for what he called the soldier's lunch. Around him, test subjects in uniform chewed and timed every bite, while in Washington, the U.S. Quartermaster Corps faced a question no army had ever answered. How do you feed 11 million men scattered across the globe? The result was the K-ration, a scientific meal in a cardboard box, weighing just under a pound and packing 3,200 calories. Inside, every item was chosen by chemistry and psychology alike. Processed cheese for protein, biscuits for starch, chocolate for quick sugar, cigarettes for calm, and soluble coffee for a taste of home. It was the fusion of nutrition and morale, a symbol of industrial precision disguised as lunch. Across the Pacific, Japan's answer was built not in laboratories but in tradition. The Type 1 and Type 2 combat rations contained rice, pickled plums, and dried fish, barely 2,000 calories on paper, and often less by the time mold and humidity took their share. Tropical campaigns turned rice barrels sour. Horses collapsed hauling sacks through jungle mud. While the U.S. Army studied dehydration curves and calorie retention, Japanese quartermasters prayed for dry weather. An American GI could fry bacon on a helmet's curve, while a Japanese private boiled roots in a dented canteen. One system fed an empire of machines, the other, an empire of endurance. By 1944, the contrast was unmistakable. Spam became as vital as ammunition. 100 million cans shipped by rail, truck, and Liberty ship. Milk, corned beef, powdered eggs, all standardized, tested, sealed, and sent. American food was not merely sustenance. It was strategy. POWs later recalled their disbelief when guards handed out leftovers that seemed fit for officers. Only then did they understand that the U.S. fought not just with factories, but with farms, that victory itself had been mass-produced. In the camps that followed, this revelation deepened America's strength. They realized was not only forged in steel, but grown in soil. June 1944. Saipan's hills still smoked when the sun rose over the shattered cane fields. The air smelled of burnt cordite and salt, of rain on coral rubble. Beneath that haze, the last survivors of the imperial garrison stumbled out of caves, blood-crusted, hollow-eyed, some clutching grenades without pins. To surrender was to cease being Japanese, yet the Marines who surrounded them did not raise rifles. They raised canteens. Medics in dusty khaki crouched beside men who had fought to the last round and handed them metal cups of broth. The first sip stunned them. It was warm, salty, almost sweet. Nothing like the bitter miso that had sustained them through weeks of siege. When bread followed, soft and white, a few prisoners whispered that it was a trick. Then came the squares of brown, glossy chocolate, still faintly perfumed by waxed paper. One soldier later wrote that it was a strange sweet that melted too fast, his first taste of a Hershey bar. At first they refused, certain it was poison. Imperial indoctrination had promised that capture meant torture, cannibalism, or humiliation. But hunger was stronger than fear. Within hours, the men who had cursed Western indulgence were scraping their tin plates clean. Butter, once despised as foreign corruption, slid across their tongues like revelation. Some wept when guards refilled their coffee. Others bowed awkwardly, unable to reconcile mercy with defeat. U.S. Army observers from the psychological warfare branch noted every detail, calling it nutrition shock, a physiological surrender that loosened hatred faster than interrogation ever could. To the Americans, the scene was routine. Another batch of prisoners. Another meal served from field kitchens powered by logistics. But for the captured Japanese, the act overturned an entire worldview. The enemy fed them as they had never been fed by their own empire. Under the scent of frying rations, pride dissolved into bewilderment. Saipan's prison compounds would become the first classrooms of an unexpected lesson, that compassion could taste like victory. December 1944, on the humid plateau above Agana Bay. Camp Guam buzzed with the clatter of mess trays and the low hum of diesel stoves. Rows of Quonset huts shimmered under the tropical sun, housing thousands of Japanese prisoners, the largest concentration yet assembled in the Pacific. They arrived hollow-cheeked, uniforms hanging in tatters, still clinging to the belief that indulgence was weakness. When the first rations were issued, soft bread, cabbage stew, slices of meat, milk poured from tin cans, they laughed bitterly. "Animals eat like this," one officer muttered, turning the food with his spoon. To the men who had survived on a handful of rice and pickled plums, the American meal seemed both obscene and absurd. But the body was quicker than pride. Within days, the mocking quieted. Hunger rewrote conviction as swiftly as any sermon. Camp cooks remembered the shift clearly. Prisoners who had scoffed at butter now begged for seconds of stew and even ice cream. Guards smiled, half in amusement, half in sympathy. One diary later found in Japan described the transformation with quiet astonishment. The enemy who fed us like kings treated us as men. It was a sentence that captured what the U.S. Army's Psychological Warfare Division had already calculated. The stomach was an instrument of persuasion. Each prisoner received roughly 3,000 calories a day, according to Geneva standards: bread, vegetables, meat, milk, fruit. But more than nourishment, each meal carried an idea. Pamphlets printed in Japanese explained that such abundance was not decadence, but democracy. That in America's view, even enemies deserved dignity. Officers who once scorned the West's excess began to request recipes. One was seen tracing English words for gravy and cream. Camp menus quietly evolved. Rice and miso soup appeared beside roast beef, an edible truce on metal trays. By early 1945, the compound had changed in spirit. The clang of utensils replaced the silence of shame. Conversations began over coffee refills. Laughter crept back between bites. What had started as mockery became craving, and craving became understanding. In Camp Guam, the war's fiercest contrasts, discipline and indulgence, hierarchy and humanity, found reconciliation in something as simple as a shared meal. The Empire's warriors, once certain that virtue meant hunger, learned that strength could also wear the face of generosity. May 1945, on the fringes of Manila Bay, where palm trees leaned over fields cratered by months of shellfire, a new kind of army operation began. It was not an assault, but a feeding. Convoys of U.S. trucks rolled into hastily fenced compounds, each carrying supplies marked not with division numbers but with words like Spam, oatmeal, and fruit preserves. The war was nearly over, yet the machinery of logistics had shifted from destruction to sustenance. In the Philippines, Okinawa, and Hawaii, more than 120,000 Japanese prisoners now depended on American kitchens, an enterprise so vast it rivaled a national relief campaign. Each man received an army mess kit, the same kind issued to U.S. soldiers. The metal tray, divided into neat compartments, carried more than food. It carried equality. Breakfast might bring oatmeal thick with sugar, lunch a Spam hash spiced with onions, dinner stewed vegetables and bread. Even the simplest jam or coffee was treated like treasure. Army nurses wrote in medical logs that malnourished prisoners gained weight with astonishing speed. Some doubled their body mass within 2 months. In letters home, captives described their disbelief that the enemy fed them better than their own officers ever had. To the Americans, this mercy was methodical. The War Department saw nutrition as a tool of re-education, a living demonstration of democracy's strength. For the prisoners, it was a quiet revolution. Years of indoctrination collapsed beneath the steady rhythm of 3 meals a day. Japanese cultural officers later testified that the treatment in American camps changed the spirit of thousands, teaching them that defeat need not mean dishonor. Under the stars and stripes, men who had once vowed to die for the emperor now lined up for breakfast, spoons in hand, discovering that compassion could conquer where conquest had failed. The taste of mercy, they realized, was the first flavor of peace. Spring 1945, long before the ink dried on Japan's surrender documents, a quieter campaign was already reshaping the minds of its captured soldiers. In a windowless office in Naos, Washington, analysts of the Office of War Information pored over field reports from the Pacific, studying not troop movements but menus. They called it Operation Campus, a classified effort to measure how mercy, expressed through food, could fracture ideology. The conclusion startled even its architects. Exposure to abundance could unsettle belief as effectively as fear. Every bowl of soup or spoonful of ice cream carried the power to dissolve years of indoctrination. Japanese soldiers had been raised on the notion that Americans were crude, gluttonous, and lazy, men incapable of sacrifice. Yet in the camps, they found efficiency without cruelty and generosity without weakness. At Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, guards noticed prisoners volunteering for kitchen duties simply to learn how to cook American-style stews. A U.S. sergeant joked that rice was no longer sacred once butter appeared, but the comment masked a deeper truth. What had once symbolized the moral gulf between East and West was becoming the bridge that spanned it. Food had become language, a weapon wrapped in kindness. The Army's psychological warfare branch understood the symbolism. A tray divided into fair portions, a cup refilled without condescension, a recipe shared across enemy lines. Each gesture undermined the myth of Japanese invincibility. POW diaries captured this transformation in words that would echo for decades. America is a nation with godlike kitchens. Sociologists later cited the phrase as proof that material comfort could humble even the most disciplined minds. In a war fought with steel and fire, the softest weapon had no trigger. It was the steady rhythm of meals served without malice, a reminder that the enemy's true power was not in destruction, but in the civilized art of feeding. 44. Across the American Midwest, the war was fought not with rifles but with rolling pins, conveyor belts, and endless steam. Inside the quartermaster general's network, 200 meatpacking plants, 70,000 dairies, and 4,000 bakeries worked around the clock under blackout curtains. The throb of machinery and the hiss of pressure cookers replaced gunfire as the soundtrack of victory. By year's end, American factories had produced over 150 million K-rations and 250 million cans of Spam, each one a tiny capsule of calories, chemistry, and confidence. Behind every meal served to a soldier or a prisoner stood the hum of a continent that had mastered abundance. Half a world away, Japan's empire was starving. Allied submarines had already sunk more than 90% of its merchant fleet, strangling the flow of rice from Indochina and fish from the South Seas. Garrison troops on isolated islands learned to boil roots and chew palm bark, their bodies wasting while American Marines ate canned peaches under jungle tarps. The imbalance was not just material, it was spiritual. To the captured Japanese who later sat before a tray of bread, Spam hash, and coffee, the meal represented something far larger than sustenance. It was the taste of a civilization that could feed millions even while waging war on 3 fronts. When Japanese officers in POW camps inspected American kitchens, they saw more than efficiency. They saw a kind of national machine that fused democracy and discipline. Every loaf of bread, every ladle of stew symbolized an industrial order that transformed farms into arsenals. Historians would later call it the caloric front, where production lines replaced bayonets and nourishment became a weapon of morale. The prisoners' astonishment was the echo of a deeper realization that America's might did not rest solely on bombs or battleships, but on the quiet power of competence. Early 1945, beneath the rustle of palm trees in camps from Guam to Hawaii, the war's most surprising transformation was unfolding not through lectures, but through lunch. Japanese culture had long sanctified simplicity, teaching that virtue lived in plain rice and miso, and that indulgence was a symptom of decay. Yet the first mouthfuls of American food defied every law of that creed. Bread so soft it tore under its own weight, syrup that shimmered like amber, butter that melted across the tongue. These were not luxuries, but lessons. For men who had survived on mold and millet, such flavors bordered on the divine. Army psychologists observed the change in precise stages: suspicion, then curiosity, then surrender. At first, prisoners ate cautiously, glancing at their guards as though expecting punishment. Then came the slow uncoiling of fear. When a corporal offered refills of coffee or jam, some men wept openly. The indoctrination that had painted Americans as beasts dissolved with every meal served without contempt. "They fed us as equals," one captured ensign later recalled, "and that destroyed everything we believed about them." The chow line, with its identical trays and measured portions, became an unintended classroom in democracy, proof that dignity could exist without rank. For the U.S. officers who managed the camps, this effect was almost alchemical. Violence declined, cooperation increased, and interpreters reported a new word whispered among the prisoners: yasashisa, kindness. A former Japanese naval officer, interviewed years later, summarized the revelation in one unforgettable phrase: "I learned democracy from butter and sugar." In those mess halls, taste had become truth. It had shown that civilization's strength was not forged in cruelty or conquest, but in the quiet power of generosity shared across the table. Autumn 1945, while the Pacific still smoldered, American newspapers carried photographs that seemed almost unthinkable. Japanese prisoners, once sworn to die for the emperor, now sat in orderly rows at long wooden tables, smiling faintly as they ate ice cream from tin bowls. For families who had lost sons at Pearl Harbor or Bataan, the images felt like betrayal. Letters poured into Washington demanding to know why the men who had bombed civilians were being fed like guests. Yet the War Department stood its ground. Feeding the enemy, they insisted, was not indulgence, it was strategy. Generosity, one memo read, is propaganda in reverse. The Red Cross joined the effort, assembling care packages filled with cigarettes, canned fruit, and soap for distribution in POW camps from Wisconsin to Guam. Hollywood newsreels played the contrast to full effect, American captors serving full meals to prisoners, while Japan's own atrocities in the Philippines flashed beside them. Slowly, outrage gave way to a quieter pride. The same abundance that had won the war now became a testament to moral strength. Democracy, Americans realized, did not have to mirror the cruelty it defeated. Across the Midwest, this principle found its most human expression. Farmers in Iowa and Minnesota hired POWs to help harvest corn and wheat, often inviting them to share dinner afterward. One farmer remembered how the boys bowed before eating and said thank you in broken English. For both sides, the gesture bridged oceans of bitterness. The act of feeding ceased to be political and became personal, an unspoken declaration that decency had survived the war. In the simple ritual of passing bread across the table, America found its reflection, a nation proving that mercy could stand beside might, and that victory was not complete until compassion was served. October 1946. Dawn broke gray over Yokohama Harbor as repatriation ships nosed through the mist, their decks crowded with thin men in faded khaki. The tide brought them home not as heroes but as survivors, carrying few possessions, yet each bearing memories that defied their nation's propaganda. Among the duffel bags and cardboard boxes were small contraband treasures, a can of Spam wrapped in cloth, a folded menu from a camp kitchen, a handwritten recipe for stew or cornbread. These were more than souvenirs. They were symbols of a new understanding. To the men who had once sneered at American excess, these flavors had become emblems of dignity. In post-war Japan, hunger ruled every household. Cities lay in ashes, ration lines stretched for blocks, and rice was measured by the ounce. Into that landscape of scarcity came the strange gifts of captivity. Former POWs told their families of soft bread, of coffee rich and bitter, of ice cream so cold it stung the tongue. They spoke of meals served without cruelty, of equality found in a chow line. Anthropologists would later call this phenomenon the culinary occupation, the quiet absorption of values through taste. Across the ruins, ex-prisoners opened cafes named Victory Bread or Camp Coffee, blending Western indulgence with Japanese modesty. By the mid-1950s, the transformation was unmistakable. Japanese kitchens now echoed with the hiss of frying oil and the scent of butter, ingredients once condemned as symbols of decadence. The diet of an empire had evolved into that of a democracy. What began as nourishment behind barbed wire had become a national reinvention, a fusion of humility and abundance. Those who had tasted mercy in captivity carried it home as conviction. The empire that had once worshipped sacrifice now rebuilt itself with bread, milk, and the quiet strength of gratitude. 49. Tokyo's morning trains rattled past billboards advertising bread, milk, and margarine, where only a few years earlier slogans had preached sacrifice and purity. Historians would later say that the seed of this transformation was planted not in factories or parliament halls, but in the dining halls of American POW camps. There, captured soldiers had first encountered the idea that efficiency and compassion could coexist, that abundance itself could be a form of strength. After the war, that revelation became the blueprint for a nation's rebirth. During the 1950s, American food aid, Flour, powdered milk, soy oil flooded Japan's reconstruction programs under the same logic that once governed the mess trays: productivity through nourishment. The Ministry of Education modeled its new school lunch system on U.S. nutritional standards, serving bread and milk as daily rituals of progress. What had begun as humiliation turned into imitation. The lessons learned in captivity now shaped a generation raised on calories, not commandments. Japan's recovery merged Western industrial efficiency with its own precision and restraint, creating a hybrid identity fueled by innovation rather than deprivation. By the 1960s, the transformation was complete. Television jingles praised butter, bread, and ice cream, with the same fervor once reserved for the emperor's name. The empire that had worshipped austerity now celebrated appetite as national virtue. In this irony lay a quiet truth. The same abundance that conquered Japan had also taught it how to rise again. From the camp kitchens of Guam to the neon canteens of Tokyo, food had become more than sustenance. It was ideology, the proof that mercy and modernity could feed the same dream. August 1945. The Pacific lay calm again, its waters silver beneath the first peace in years. On the decks of hospital ships and within the barbed wire perimeters of distant camps, the final battles were not fought with rifles, but with rations. The first Japanese prisoners who had mocked American food believed they were laughing at weakness, at a culture too soft to endure hardship. But by war's end, that laughter had turned to silence and then to understanding. Abundance, they discovered, was not decadence. It was discipline, compassion, and power woven together. Every spoonful of milk, every slice of bread offered across the lines, carried the quiet authority of a nation that could feed even its foes. What began as a meal became a message. The same hands that had once carried bayonets now reached for trays. The same men who had starved in the emperor's name now found dignity in sustenance. The lessons learned in those camps endured far beyond their fences, shaping Japan's kitchens, schools, and industries for decades to come. The soldiers who had fought to die for hunger's honor returned home knowing that survival, too, could be noble. In the Pacific, fire and steel decided victory, but compassion defined its legacy. The empire that once bowed before the sword found redemption in a meal, and in that silent exchange between conqueror and captive, humanity revealed its truest strength, that the greatest triumph is not in how one destroys, but in how one feeds the defeated.